There's no picture for the Jesus tree today. I wondered how you'd got on with Joseph, looking at connection points between his story and that of Jesus, looking at how God has been at work. And you can see that he's putting pieces in place that will eventually lead us to Jesus' place in history. Symbols and similarities like the prophecies that were given to Joseph in the form of dreams. And he was so sure that God was at work in those dreams that it does come across as arrogance when he's speaking to his brothers, but it's because he's faithful to the calling of God on his life, and he believes it. Just as we recognize in this time of Lent that Jesus could do what he did, avoiding all the temptation of the devil in the desert because he believed in his calling. Thinking about Joseph being raised from the pit of death in order to see God's plan through, just as Jesus died to complete God's plan. Being paid for by pieces of silver. But perhaps the piece of the story that is most telling is the fact that if you go back to the Abraham story, you discover God foretold that his people would go to a land that wasn't their own and would be in slavery for 400 years. And of course that comes about because Joseph is in Egypt at the time of the famine and calls Jacob to join him. And the people of Israel being another name for Jacob, travel from Canaan to Egypt and prosper and become so successful that the Egyptians eventually become jealous, and that's where the slavery comes in. You see, the whole point of this Jesus tree is that we recognize that since Eve took a bite of that apple, since the serpent successfully deceived Adam and Eve, God has been at work to put things right. God is doing everything to bring us back into relationship with him. So before we continue with adding pictures to the Jesus tree, I thought it would be a good place to pause and ask ourselves, if we have Joseph's conviction of our calling, our part in God's plan, are we convinced that God is in control? And if so, how do our lives reflect that? Do we recognize that we can have a part in answering other people's prayers? And that's the way God is using us to fulfill plans that we cannot see and may never be aware of. Can you look back on your life and see how God has put pieces in place, just as he is through these stories on the Jesus tree, just as he did in working through Joseph's calling and his slavery and his imprisonment and then his freedom, to move his people into place in such a way that they would recognize God's deliverance. That's the connection between Joseph's story, the Egypt story, and the story of Jesus. The story of how people come to recognize Jesus as deliverer. We can be part of that story for others. In our witness, in our being answers to other people's prayers, in praying for others, in showing that Jesus is in control. How will you become a part of another story to salvation? Today, tomorrow, next week. I pray that we are all part of God's salvation story. I'll bring you more pictures for the Jesus tree tomorrow.